Georgy Zhukov stood by the window, watching the snow fall over Red Square. In his hand was a transcript of a radio intercept, a message from the German High Command that should have been a victory. Instead, it was a death sentence. The room was suffocatingly quiet. Behind him, the most powerful man in Eurasia sat hunched over a desk, his pipe unlit, his eyes fixed on a map that hadn't moved in hours. The offer from the Nazis was simple, almost elegant. An exchange, a field marshal for a lieutenant, a king for a pawn. Zhukov knew the boy, he knew the father. He also knew that in this room, silence was the only way to survive. But what Zhukov felt in that moment, the cold realization of what kind of man he was actually serving, was never written in the official Soviet chronicles. What he whispered to his closest aide later that night wasn't just a comment on the war. It was a terrifying insight into a soul that had no room for blood or kin. And as Zhukov looked at the man behind the desk, he realized the war in the trenches was nothing compared to the war happening inside this office. The decision had already been made. Now the world just had to wait for the bodies to drop. By early 1943, the Soviet machine was finally humming. Zhukov had saved Moscow. He had encircled the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. On the surface, the Red Army was an unstoppable tide of steel and vengeance. Orders were followed without question. The maps in the Stavka were updated with surgical precision. To the outside world, Zhukov and Stalin were a unified front, the Iron Fist and the Iron Will. To Zhukov believed the chaos of 1941 was behind them. The systems were working. Logistics were flowing. The intelligence reports coming from the front lines were consistent. The Germans were bleeding out. Everything was under control. There was a protocol for everything, even for captured officers. Zhukov operated on the logic of a chess master. You trade pieces to gain position. You protect your assets. It was a professional understanding of war. But what Zhukov hadn't accounted for was that Stalin wasn't playing chess. He was playing a game where the pieces weren't just wood and felt, they were his own reflection. And while Zhukov saw a stable front, he failed to see the hairline fracture forming in the one place he couldn't control, Stalin's ego. What none of them realized was how wrong the assumption of stability truly was. It started with a report that didn't fit the pattern. It wasn't about a division move or a fuel shortage. It was a personal message, filtered through Swedish channels, then grabbed by Soviet signals intelligence. The Germans had a prize, Yakov Dzhugashvili, Stalin's eldest son. Zhukov watched the report land on the desk. This should have been a straightforward diplomatic leverage point. The Germans wanted Field Marshal Marshal Paulus back, the man Zhukov had just humiliated at Stalingrad, a field marshal for a lieutenant. It was an insultingly good deal for the Soviets. But then, the reports from the front started to change. The tone of the messages from Stalin's office grew cold. Not toward the Germans, but toward the very idea of the exchange. Zhukov noticed the shift. The system was no longer reacting to military logic. One detail in the report was ignored. The fact that Yakov hadn't surrendered willingly. He had been overwhelmed. But in the Kremlin, that distinction was being erased. A decision was being reached in total isolation from the military staff. That decision would haunt them. Instead of weighing the strategic value of the exchange, the atmosphere in the Kremlin curdled. Zhukov tried to bring up the logistics of the prisoner situation during a late-night briefing. Stalin didn't even look up. He simply remarked that in the Red Army, there are no prisoners of war, only traitors. Zhukov felt the air leave the room. He realized that pulling back now, or even suggesting a humanitarian angle, would be admitting something worse, that the leader of the Soviet Union was vulnerable to emotion. So the pressure was doubled. Could the Soviet propaganda machine begin to lean harder into the not a step back policy? It wasn't just a military order anymore. It was a personal wall Stalin was building around his own heart. The Germans, sensing a psychological breakthrough, leaked photos of Yakov in the camps. They expected a father's weakness. They got a tyrant's resolve. Zhukov watched as Stalin's jaw set into stone. The gamble was no longer about winning the war. It was about Stalin proving he was more machine than man. That's when the situation crossed the point of no return. This is where the history books stop and the nightmare begins. After the formal refusal, the famous line, "I will not trade a marshal for a soldier," The doors to the inner sanctum closed. Zhukov wasn't just a general, he was a witness. In the late hours fueled by tea and tobacco, Zhukov saw a version of Stalin the public never knew. It wasn't a moment of grief, it was a moment of profound, icy resentment. Zhukov later noted to his inner circle that Stalin didn't seem to hate the Germans for capturing his son. He seemed to hate his son for being captured. Zhukov's private thoughts, recorded in various memoirs and whispered accounts, reveal a terrifying epiphany. He realized that if Stalin could discard his own flesh and blood to maintain a mask of totalitarian perfection, then none of the generals, none of the heroes of the Soviet Union, were safe. Behind those closed doors, Zhukov saw the truth. The man leading them didn't love the motherland. He loved the power he held over it. Zhukov wanted to say it. He wanted to tell the man of steel that this wasn't strength, it was a pathology. But he didn't say it out loud. Not yet. The fear was too heavy. From that moment on, the war changed for Zhukov. The orders he received became increasingly disconnected from the human cost. If a son was a pawn, what was a division? What were 10,000 men in a swamp? The strategy became a series of reactions to Stalin's need for absolute, unblemished victory. Yet the human cost of the final push toward Berlin was staggering, even by Soviet standards. Zhukov realized he was no longer a strategist. He was an executioner for a man who had already executed his own feelings. The fallout wasn't just in the camps where Yakov eventually died, throwing himself against an electric fence. It was in the way the Soviet high command operated. Paranoia became the primary fuel. Every success was scrutinized for signs of Bonapartism. Every general was a potential rival to be broken. And this wasn't the worst part. Years later, after the flags were raised and the dictator was in the ground, Zhukov reflected on that refusal. He realized it wasn't a moment of Soviet heroism. It was the moment Zhukov realized that power has limits. Stalin could control the borders of nations, for he could move millions of people with a stroke of a pen, but he couldn't control the shame of a father. So he destroyed the source of the shame. Zhukov saw the hollow center of the empire. He saw that the great patriotic war was won by people who were squeezed between two different kinds of terror, one that wore a swastika and one that wore a familiar, mustachioed smile. The exchange wasn't a military decision. It was a ritual sacrifice. Today, historians still debate that moment in the Kremlin. Some say it was the ultimate act of leadership, a leader showing his people that he suffered the same as them, that no one was above the law of the state. They argue that if Stalin had saved his son, the Red Army's morale would have shattered. The others see it as the ultimate evidence of a sociopath, a man so obsessed with his own mythos that he let his own blood perish rather than admit a single human moment of weakness. Was this the peak of wartime leadership under impossible pressure? Or was it the moment a father's ego finally outweighed his humanity, setting a precedent for a century of cold-blooded rule? The archives are open, but the heart of that decision remains locked. What do you think? Did Stalin do what a leader must do, or did he simply reveal he was the monster the world already feared he was? Leave a comment below. History hasn't decided yet. Maybe you can.